One of the most fundamental concepts that we deal with when we're working on, on code is control of flow. This is pretty much the, biggest thing that, the biggest task that we end up working on or kind of completing while we are in there and trying to make changes. Often we're going to be editing, or working with flow control and manipulating that somehow. And at its most basic, you can think of this as sections of the code where we're going to determine which path we're going to go down. A very simple and common one is an if statement, and basically we say, if some condition that we test is true, then we're going to execute another statement. We can also throw that in an else, or combine that with an else, which would look more like what this image shows, which it says, if this condition is true, then we're going to do whatever's here. If it's false, we're going to do whatever is here. If we look at this in terms of what the PHP code would look like, very simply, we would start this off, and it would look like if some variable or some condition, doesn't matter what it is. Right here, we're just testing the variable. We could easily say, if this is greater than 100, if this is less than 200, if it has a character length greater than 75, any arbitrary condition we wanted to check. Then we're going to execute this if true, right? And that would represent, the code that I have here represents basically this left half of this if condition. It says if this, then go ahead and do that. If we want to throw in the right side, we include an else with this. So the idea is that this gets execute this if false. The idea is that this will get tested. It will say, if this is true, then any code that's in between these two brackets will get executed. If it is false, any code in between these two brackets will get executed. So this is one of the more simpler ways of looking at flow control. There's a whole lot that goes into this. We have, if, this is basically an if then else statement is what this is referred to as, right? So this part would be the if then, and then this would be the else. This looks pretty common among different languages. So if we had, in JavaScript, it would look very similar. We would do if some condition, because JavaScript doesn't use the $sign to reference variables. You can, but it's not common. We'll put here, execute if true, else execute this if false. And then, of course, we're going to end our script tag. Pretty simple. It's pretty much identical when we're working with this. And in a lot of languages, they share, this shares a common pattern. The if, then, else flow control is going to be one of your most encountered that you're going to see while you're working on stuff. Maybe there's not going to be an else. Maybe it's just an if. Sometimes there will be an else. But this is going to be the most common flow control that you're going to see. Next, we have a switch or a case. This happens where just imagine we have a situation where we're going to want to test multiple values or compare things for multiple values. So like a good example would be, let's say that we want to take a user's input. Right now we're just going to focus on, we're going to set that in a variable. But let's just imagine we have some input. I'm going to rename this to input then. Input equals green. And let's say that we want to output the hexadecimal value of whatever text is in here, right? So like green would be red, green, blue, for instance, right? And then we know that red would be this. And then we know that blue would be this. And we could also throw in some other ones here. Let's say that this is what we know that we want to see, right? This is blue, this is red, this is green. And now we know that, we want to return or give these kind of values based off of this input, right? So real quick, before we get to that, I'm going to introduce another element in control flow that's helpful, that is also very common. That's called a function. And a function is basically just a way for us to take a set of instructions and store that in a common name. So I'm going to say get hex value, and then we're going to put this in Word. No, we're gonna name this color. And again, I want to we are going to show PHP syntax on this. Okay. All right, so we have this function that we're going to create. Now, one way that we could do this is we could just say if color equals green, return, okay, and then we can go on if color equals red, then we're going to return, sorry, and so on and so forth. But this would be terrible. The reason is because if we're going to have 100 different items, we're going to have all this code here, and it's just going to get long and convoluted. This is one of the better examples in terms of really it's just depending on the state, we just execute one line. Just imagine if we were doing something a little bit more complicated that would require 20, 30, 100 lines of code just to accomplish whatever goal we're trying to shoot for, right? So thankfully we have switches. So we can actually do switch color. We're going to say case green, return, we're actually supposed to throw, in this situation we don't have to worry about it because we're doing a return, but one way you can differentiate between these, so I'm going to put here, I'm going to say this is retval equals, and the reason we throw this break is you'll see as once I have all this, the rest of it in here, the break keeps it from cascading, which is one thing that switches you can use that to your advantage in switches, and I'll show you some of that here after this. So we're going to say retval. We're at red, so it's actually this. Okay, so we have our switch here. We also can throw in a default with this, and this is kind of like everything else. This is our catch-all, right? And we could say retval equals invalid. Just to let them know, they gave us, in our world, all we have is green, red, and blue. There's nothing outside of that. Decrease this size, and then we could just say return retval. And then here we are going to echo has a right. I'm going to go ahead and get rid of this. I'm actually going to go ahead and save this so that we can see what this looks like. I'm going to replace it. I'm going to open up my terminal, And then here we can see an example. We can go PHP test.php. Good old syntax error 24. Yep, forgot my lucky semicolon there. All right, and then here it lets us know green has a hex value of this, right? And I could have thrown a new line at the end of there. That probably would have been a good idea. But you get the idea, right? So this is a switch. This is what this looks like. I am not going to include, I'm not going to continue to include the JavaScript equivalent of this because, to be honest, it's pretty much going to be the same except for how they reference variables and stuff like that. It's going to look almost identical in JavaScript when we're dealing with the switch. So the switch was another very common one. And basically, those are your two main choices that you're going to have when you have choice, right? You're either going to want an if then else statement, like we shown in this first example, or you're going to want to switch, which is in this example here. That's pretty much all you're going to deal with when you're working with choice. Now the next part of flow control are going to be loops, right? We discussed this. We're going to do another one. View syntax PHP. So a loop is when you use a loop or some kind of loop when you want to execute code again and again. Now, that's not to be confused with a function, because the idea behind a function is that we just know that this is going to be a common task and that we want to store this algorithm. That's basically what it is. It's an algorithm. It's like a cookbook or a recipe. We know that we want to take a value, do a recipe on it, and then give something back. If we know that we're going to do that frequently, we'll throw that in a function. That doesn't necessarily mean that we're going to do it in a loop, because the difference with a loop is you're going to run it one after the other, as opposed to with a function just means that, at some random time in the future, we're going to go ahead and execute it. Now, with that said, we could easily throw functions inside of loops, but functions and loops serve two distinct purposes. Okay, so at its simplest, we can do, do while is something that's less encountered. But let's see here. So a very common one that gets used in a multitude of different languages is going to be the for loop. So let's just say here, what am I going to do here? Let's say here that we have an array of whatever. We're just going to say elements equals hello world test, for instance, right? We can use a for loop, and we're going to say for I equals 0, I is less than count elements, I plus plus, we're going to echo elements I. All right, I'm actually going to go ahead and save this as test2. And here we see it looped through everything. I included the proper new line so it doesn't look funny. See, it outputted hello, world, and test in that order. And so if we break this down, what this does is it creates this second variable that we have. And then the second statement is always going to be the limit. So it's going to say, hey, we start off and I is going to be 0. The limit then that we're going to do this until is whenever I is this. And then the last statement, we increment it. We could also, this is what you're going to see. It's going to be I plus plus. And so we're going to increment it. We could also do I plus equals 2. And to go ahead and save this and just see what it works. It should, yeah. See, we skipped that middle one because we never, we did I equals 2. So the first time that we execute this, I was 1. Let's do this breakdown here. The first time we execute, and then it tests an array elements inside this, right? That's what count does. So count elements here is going to return 3. If we had 4 items in this, it would return 4. So it's just whatever the number of items in this array is what this is. So on the first execution is less than 3. So we're going to go ahead and spit out the 0th element of this array. And it's going to be hello, as we saw here. Now in its modified form, I plus equals 2, what it does is after it executes this, it goes through and it says, all right, I was 0. All right, let's add 2 to that. And it's going to verify, okay, 2 is less than 3, so we're good. And then it's going to go ahead and execute and say, all right, what's the second, with an offset of 0, element of this array? And that is going to be test. And that's what it spits out. Next, it goes through and says, all right, last round I was 2. Let's add 2 to this. So we get 4. And then here's where it fails the test, right? It says, okay, 4 is actually greater than 3. And then it exits, right? There's nothing more that it needs to do. It can't print the 4th element of this array. So it just quits. I++. On the other hand, we picked up that the world because it went from 0 to 1, then finally to 2. So this is probably one of the more simple forms of loops. This is one that you'll see often. This is one that's, well, not so much in PHP, but you see this used more in other languages. I'm going to go ahead and comment that one out because we're going to keep it there for reference. But in PHP, there is a more common one. If we're wanting to do, if we're just wanting to loop through every element, it's more common to do what I'm going to show you next. If we wanted to do some weird stuff where we just did every other element, you would want to do this original format here because I feel like that's probably going to be your easiest method to do that. If you're wanting to manipulate or somehow use something more convoluted than in sequence, okay, that's when you would really want to use this for loop. Alternatively, PHP and some other languages have what's called a for each loop. And the syntax for that is we'll just put elements as element. Go ahead and echo elements. Go ahead and execute this again. And here we see this looks a whole lot like the first time that we executed it. It's be hello world test. Hello world test. And so, this is, pretty simple syntax. We start off with what is the array that we're working with. And then this as tells us that what we're going to do is we're just going to loop through every single one of these items and we're going to assign that element of the variable or of that array to whatever this variable is going to be. So we can actually name this like test, and we're going to put echo test. Doesn't really matter. PHP does not care. So I'm going to put it back to element because that makes a whole lot of sense for me anyways. And the thing that I really like about for each is there's no need for this intermediate variable here. So we don't have to worry about, this syntax here, which I think is a little bit less legible. Though it's not bad, it's not illegible, but I think that this looks a whole lot cleaner. But one of the things where this really shines in PHP is we're going to, this is going to be a concept outside of flow control, but in PHP and other languages, all languages actually, but it's very common in PHP, you'll have what are called maps or associative arrays. So what that means is, as we saw in this example right here, right? Hello is the 0th element, world is the first, test is the second in regards to, you know, zero offset. And I've heard that pronounced other ways, but that's just what we're going to do, you know, for the sake of this video. You can also have something like this. First element equals. You can have second. And then we're going to do third. Now, obviously, with the names I've chosen, this wouldn't really make a whole lot of sense. Why would you do this? You know, keeping it with a numbered offset is significantly more convenient, but sometimes this will be more complex, and you'll have like a users array, for instance, and you'll have Jim, and he'll have information associated with him, and it'll be like total posts is going to be equal to 47, you know, and role is going to be admin. And then we could come down here, and Bob is going to have, you know, other information that's associated with him, right? And we would want to loop through that information. Well, doing this in a traditional for loop doesn't make a whole lot of sense, because what's going to happen is, as you're looping through this, you're incrementing I, elements 0, or users 0 in this case, doesn't exist, right? So that's not going to give you any useful information. So if we come back here, this actually works perfectly with a for each. It doesn't, because for each doesn't care about whatever this reference is here that we're using, right? So if we're going to execute that, we see that for each blah 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 just gave us the information that we wanted. Hello world test. Boom, boom, boom. It doesn't care. It doesn't care about these are called indices. It doesn't care what the index name is or how it's referenced, whatever. However, if we do care, and this is pretty common, again in that user's example, if we wanted to display a table of attributes associated with various users, we would definitely use this, right? We would say index, blah, blah, and then we would put, you know, we can reference that however we want. I'm just going to throw this in here. Nope. Here we can see, I'm going to clear this out so that we can, closer to the top. Here we see it says first element, hello, second element, world, third element, test, right? So this syntax here, again, it's always going to follow this pattern. This doesn't have to be named index. This could be whatever. We could put this as test. Doesn't matter. Execute it again. And what this does is it goes through every element, and it says, if you notice, this is very similar syntax to what we had here, if that helps you kind of remember that. It goes through and it assigns the index to this first element, and then it assigns the value at that index to this second variable here. All right, pretty simple. This is a big one to remember because it is all over the place, especially in a lot of the web applications that we're working on. This is very common. This is used a whole lot whenever you're pulling information from the database. Oftentimes, it's going to be stored in one of these associative arrays, or maps, as they're called. And so a lot of times when you're wanting to traverse those arrays, you're going to use a for each loop. Another thing to consider when working on this flow control is sometimes we'll want to get out of the loop, or we'll want to skip an element in the loop. Okay, and those are called breaks and continues, respectively. I'll show you this. We can continue to use this example, right? If we want to, let's say as soon as we get to hello, we want to just pump the brakes. We're done. We don't want to execute any more of this loop. Hurry up, abort ship, get out. What we're going to do is this is a good example. We're nesting an if statement, which we discussed, inside of this other control element, right? So these are kind of the building blocks. But we can say if element is going to be equivalent to hello, break. All right, I'm gonna go ahead and execute that, and it shows you that what happened is, right, we just said first element hello, and that's it, right? What this did is it said, like we said, it tested this. First off, it executed. Then it ran this condition here, and it said, okay, well, actually, yes, on the first time that it executed it, element is equivalent to hello, and then it says break. So it said, okay, we're gonna just abandon ship. We're getting out of this for each loop. Good example to kind of help highlight this is we can say this is the end. Right, so this is something that's completely outside of this for each loop. You see that gets executed, right? So the idea is that execution did not stop, it just got outside of that for each loop, right? Because we hit this break statement. Alternatively, we can use continue, which is similar, but it says, hey, don't execute it anymore for this, just go on to the next iteration, right? And so the way that looks is we can say if element equals hello again. This time I'm doing it at the top. I mean, it doesn't really matter. You can use these wherever, but for instructional purposes, you know, for our demonstration here, continue, it makes more sense to put it up at the top here. And I'm going to go ahead and execute this. And so what we see is we actually don't see hello anymore, right? But we see world and test, and in the end as well. And that's what happened is it went through and it said, okay, well, we're first going to assign first element to index. We're going to assign hello to the element. Then it got to here and it said, all right, is element equivalent to hello? And it saw that that was true. So it just said continue. And what this line does is it says, all right, let's go back to the top. Let's start over again with the next one. The second element is going to go in index. World is going to go in element. And then it tests again. Element is not equivalent to hello. So this does not get executed. So let's go ahead and say echo. And it prints this out. So pretty simple. That's going to be, like I said, these are going to be your most, the most common ways that you're going to deal with, you know, flow control when you're programming. And to summarize, you know, those are going to be, we have if statements, right? So if, then, and then else. We could have else. Else isn't necessary, but it's possible. We can throw that in there. And like I said, that was this syntax. We have if some condition, then execute this. Otherwise, you know, this does not have to be there. But if it is, we can say that if this is not true, then we're going to execute the code that is in here. Okay, so we have if then / else. We also have switches. And those are, I mean, they get their name from a railroad switch, if that helps you memorize that. The idea is that rather than having a series of if statements, we just say, hey, we want to test this one variable. And then we supply a bunch of cases that we want to test. And then if we want to, we can throw in a default, which is kind of like the else for switches. We say that, yeah, if none of these are true, then we're going to go ahead and execute the default. Otherwise, what's between the case and the break is what's going to get executed right here. If you leave off this break, which is one thing we didn't demonstrate, but if you leave off this break, it's going to what's called cascade. So I think we can actually go ahead and save this out and kind of show you this as an example. I'm glad that we went over this. So here we're going to execute the get hex value. And I'm going to show you, when we come back here, should have just typed it out, PHP test. This says green has a hex value of FF0000, which is not true. That is red. But what happened is, in this function, it said get hex value color, we called that. We went to this switch for color. It first tried to say, hey, is this green? Yep, it sure is. So it set ret value to what the correct color for green was. However, because there was no break here, it said, all right, let's just continue let's just continue with this, right? Because that's obviously what they want. And then it set ret value to this color, to this value. And then it broke. And so that's when it got out of this switch, came down to here, and it returned ret value, which by now had the incorrect thing. This is helpful in some more advanced cases where there may be two items that are the same or that behave similarly. So for instance, you could put case light green. Like let's just say that you only wanted to offer one type of green, and so that anything that had green, we wanted to give them this value, even though that's not, that is a light green. But we can, dark green, you say case dark green. There may be better ways to do the case that I'm describing right now, but this is something that you will see and that is useful. Or sometimes maybe dark green just needs one additional step, but then it also needs to do the stuff that we do for green, in which case you would use this cascading. But that's one thing to always be mindful for. Trust me, it could make diagnosing this stuff a real pain if you're not mindful of the breaks. Okay, so we have switches, and these two are both of our conditional flow control, right? That's where we know that if we want to test something and that certain code gets executed based off of conditions, that's what we would do. We also have our loops, and of those, there are more. There are definitely more ways of doing a loop, but the two biggest are going to be your for, which we saw in this example. And where you would want to use a for over a for each is anytime where you're going to have, I'm sure there are more options, but anytime where you're going to have complex situations where you're wanting to skip certain indices, or maybe if your condition is going to be more complex, for this or something like that. Maybe if you only want to do like the first half of an array, and then if you wanted to do the second half of an array, you would do something else. Situations like that, that's where for really shines, because it gives you that added control, because you have this variable here that you're manipulating and using that to traverse the array. You also have for each. I feel like this is probably the most preferred and the most common that you'll see. And this is really good if you're just wanting to actually traverse the array. If you're not wanting to do anything crazy, like I've described in the previous example, I feel like for each really gives you a cleaner way of referencing, elements in your array. You still have that power to do stuff like I described in the previous example. So, for instance, like if we wanted to say that fourth element, blah. If we wanted to say that for every other element we are going to print the index and then the item, and then for the odd elements we would print not the index but just the element. We could do this well, this is actually going to be, in this example, this is going to be a little bit uglier. But for instance, if we go back to having a numeric, let's do that. It would be simpler for demonstration. If we're going to go back to having numeric indices, right, which would start off at 0, we come here and we would say if index mod 2, which lets us know that this is another common thing that you're going to see. It's modulo. And so the idea is that it basically gives you the remainder of any division. So to put that, in another way, you can look at it this way: 0 mod 2 is going to be equal to 0. 1 mod 2 is going to be equal to 1. 2 mod 2 is going to be equal to 0. 3 mod 2 is going to be equal to 1. And so on. It's going to continue that pattern. It's only ever going to get to 1. And so you can think about that. 0 divided by 2, so of course 0, there's no remainder. 1 divided by 2, 1 does not go into 2 evenly, so it's 0 with a remainder of 1. 2 divided by 2, they go into each other evenly, so it gives you a remainder of 0. The way you can think of this modulo is it will reset, and it will never get equal to or higher than whatever this is, right? So like if we wanted to count in our series from 0, 1, 2, 3, right? And then we were going to have a variable that constantly went up. So like in this example, we had something that was going to be 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, right? We would do mod 4. Because mod 4 would give us 0, 1, 2, 3, and then as soon as we hit something that was a multiple of 4, we'd go right back to 0 because there'd be no remainder. So going back to our example at hand, we are trying to, let's just say that we are going to print the actual, let's say, okay, so we're gonna do, this is a good example, if the item is not every other one, right? So with the first one, we're gonna print it. So we're gonna put echo. And the second one, we're just gonna go ahead and for every other one, we are going to echo censored. Keep it nice and simple there. We can do all sorts of weird stuff if we wanted to. It's like a Bob Ross painting. We can just do whatever we want, whatever makes us happy. In this situation, we are going to just echo censored. All right, I'm going to go ahead and hope that there's no syntax errors. Boom. Here, this worked perfectly, right? We said hello because the way it executed is it said, all right, we're back to numeric indices, so index is going to be 0. Element's going to be hello. It went ahead and saw that 0 modulo 2 is actually 0, which evaluates to false. And so it decided to spit that item out and just say hello. Then we went ahead again, and it said, all right, index is going to be 1. Element is going to be world. 1 modulo 2 is 1, because 1 does not go into 2. So that 1 evaluated to true, and so it echoed censored right here. And because this was true and it got executed, it completely disregarded this, and then it went on to the next one, and so on and so forth. So that's it. And then there's also functions which don't really fit into this kind of mindset. It's definitely, functions are definitely a part of flow control, but not in the same sense as these two are. Functions instead are more like recipes. They're a way to take a particular set of instructions and store those in a meaningful way so that we can reference them later without having to copy and paste a bunch of code. That is one thing that is really a good sign that you are not doing things correctly, is if you find yourself going through and copying and pasting large chunks of code, that's a good indicator that you are not on the right path. That some, but yeah, it makes your code less maintainable, because let's say, for instance, that you are, whatever, in this get hex value. This is a good example. Like, let's say we had multiple instances where we wanted to do this. Well, we could, just copy and paste it and do all this other stuff. But like, let's say that, for instance, 3 months down the line, we want to add, we also want to be able to add, turquoise, and we want to be able to handle that. Well, you have a nightmare on your hands if before you were copying and pasting, because now you're going to have to copy and you're going to have to throw this in there. You're going to have to find it. You're going to do break, blah blah blah, and you're going to have to go to all these switch cases that you had done previously to this or prior to this, and you are going to have to paste all this stuff in there. It just makes it's a complete and total headache. So you always want to be kind of looking to stash reusable code in functions. It just makes things a whole lot easier. With that said, looking at all this, and we even saw in some of these examples, all of these can go inside one of another, right? These are all building blocks. So you can actually, functions are very frequently going to have, at least conditions, if not loops as well. Loops can definitely have functions and conditions in them. Conditions can have functions and loops in them. You can even have functions that contain conditions that contain functions that contain loops. I mean, it just loops in, it weaves in and out of itself in terms of this complexity. So that's why these are your biggest building blocks when we're working on programming. I can think of nothing more fundamental than this concept, and it's something that you should really take to heart. And yeah, that's it. So if you have any questions, feel free to email me, leave a comment. Thanks.